Okay. My This for today is examination and functional evaluation and assessment in special children, basic prerequisites and why. It's not moving forward. Okay. Now, what is CVI? CVI is cerebral visual impairment, is a deficiency of vision due to damage or malfunction of the visual pathways and the centers in the brain, specifically that next posterior to the lateral geniculate body, which is accentuated by disorders of the control of eye movements. Now, CVI covers a range of visual difficulties ranging from a low functioning CVI where there is profound visual impairment to a high functioning CVI where there are vision related or processing problems and cognitive visual malformations where there is normal to near normal visual acuity, but the problem is using that vision. Many a times these difficulties are associated with difficulties in processing information. Now, you have to differentiate CVI from OVI, that is ocular visual insufficiency, where you find in an OVI the eye examination in a CVI would be normal, but it would be abnormal probably in an OVI at times. Correlation of ocular findings with visual functioning, where you find that the ocular findings do not explain the visual difficulties, whereas in an OVI it does. Response to correction of treatable ocular disorders usually correlates in an OVI, but it's suboptimal in a CVI. The visual behaviors are variable because it is dependent on a lot of conditions like fatigue, discomfort, environment, clutter, background noise in a CVI, but it is consistent in an OVI. If there is any history of trauma, perinatal period, or neurological insult, is always present in a CVI but may not be there in an OVI. The latency for visual response is usually prolonged. It is normal in an OVI. Vision attention span is usually short. It's normal in the other condition. Difficulty with crowded visual information is usually present, whereas it's uncommon in the OVI. Light gazing behavior and color perception is generally common in a low functioning CVI, whereas it is uncommon in the OVI. And associated sensory cognitive behavioral difficulties are usually present with CVI but not so in OVI. So these are the basic differences between a CVI child and an OVI child behavior. Now, we need to remember that CVI does not imply total blindness. It is a spectrum of vision loss ranging from mild visual impairment to complete visual deprivation. The fundamental belief is that every child can learn, and from this is right from normal to severely mentally challenged children. So don't give up on these children ever. Now, the thing is that it is important because there is a whole lot of conditions like cerebral palsy, autism spectrum disorder, ADD, ADHD, Down syndrome, learning disabilities, dyslexia, etc., which is common with this kind of a condition, and 71% of CP children have CVI. Now, why do we have to really look after this condition? Why the visual attention? Because there is an increased prevalence of visual impairment. There are variations in visual performance, and there is an inability to communicate because of intellectual or behavioral issues. Now, what are the comorbid conditions which are associated? Are those of ROP, Downs, genetic syndromes, and metabolic problems. And OVI alone is in the other group where there's congenital cataract, optic atrophy, congenital nystagmus, congenital globe anomalies, and high refractive errors. Now, in a CVI, it is a multi pronged approach. You have to work as a team because it is not a holistic approach, it is a holistic approach where you involve not only the pediatrician, the pediatric neurologist, the ophthalmologist, the ENT specialist, the psychologist, the vision therapist, and the other neurodevelopmental therapies in forms of the PT, OT, and the speech therapy and the vision therapy. Now, here for the vision, we require the ophthalmologist, the optometrist, the therapist, and the schools, which are very important for giving them the rehabilitative measures. And as we know that there is a dorsal stream and there is a ventral stream, and in the dorsal stream dysfunction, this is noted in children with spastic diplegia. They have different problems of climbing stairs. They are enabled to reach, they knock over objects. They have simultaneous perception, and they cannot locate things in a crowded visual field. But about 50% of them have ventral stream impairments, which is seen in children with severe CVI, where they have difficulties in recognizing shapes, objects, faces. They keep forgetting where objects are placed, and they find very difficult to find their way back if they are in an unfamiliar place. So there are a battery of tests for cognitive vision assessment. That is tests for dorsal, where it involves the optic ataxia test, where you ask them to throw a ring into a rod or throw balls into a hole or a box. The simultagnosia test, where you identify one object between 20 objects, identify one toy from a toy basket, identify one alphabet in 20 alphabets, and apraxia of gaze, which gives the motility assessment. And the test for the ventral stream is that test for prosopagnosia, which is finding one flashcard amongst five cartoon characters or names of five relatives shown on a mobile phone, or where there is loss of visual memory, where you differentiate a smile from a frown or sad from happy faces. You identify shapes of two different cars with the same color, or two different cars in two different colors, color to color match. And the topographic agnosia test, where you find your way through a maze or find a shoe in a clinic with a lot of shoes around. So these are few tests which are done. And there are tests for optical visual assessment, where you copy nonsense text, dictation of nonsense words, reading a paragraph, tests for visual preservation, and rapid change of objects to know if anything persists. This is remediation in cases of CVI. Why there is need for early intervention in these children is because it has been shown to enhance visual function significantly. Sight is a key stimulus to a child's development. Sight is a development process in these children which does not happen automatically. We have five primary senses in ourselves, in a human being, and these have to be tapped, or these have to be in perfect synchrony and amount for a child to grow globally sound and robust. Seeing is a complex psychological process which affects the child's motor, cognitive, emotional, and communication functions. Now, what is the principle of visual rehab? It is important that there are some pathways which are disturbed and there are some pathways which are untapped. There are some such 30 specialized centers in the brain which can handle specific parts of visual information. So you have to sort of motivate those areas to take up the and reassign the signs of damaged area to those healthy areas, and that can be done if you are taught to do so. And this is what we call as neural plasticity, and this of course requires a multidisciplinary approach. This gives you an interrelatedness of vision with posture and sensory processing. So that's the reason why a child and all the balances of the child, whether the child stands, walks, runs, or is able to locomote, is very important. Now, what is visual functional assessment? It is an ability to make use of whatever sight they have. In this children with CVI, you have children with profound multiple learning disabilities. You have to train their residual vision to the maximum, and again, this, as I said, improves with a multidisciplinary approach. So if you see, there are standardized tests for visual acuity which has failed in children with learning disabilities because they are scared of personnel, of uniforms, equipments. They are unable to fixate. Sometimes their body posture is very wrong, inability to understand commands. So that is the reason why these are all the pitfalls which are there, and you have to be able to improve them in recognition of objects, pictures, shapes, colors, perception. They have a problem in figure ground discrimination where they cannot identify between two backgrounds. They have a problem with depth perception, visual inattention, and the capacity to learn, look and listen, or look and do. So you have to improve on all these spheres for these children for a child to be able to have a certain quality of life. So, what problems you encounter is a crying child, the first thing, abnormal eye movements, abnormal head posture, ocular anomalies, excess anxiety crying, lack of comprehension, and certain twitching body movements or athetoid body movements in certain children. So if you see this child had neck rigidity, this child had a spine problem, was had to be supported when he sits, when he lied down, there was neck rigidity and there was rigidity in the entire body. So you never get this head down, and you never get a a perfect child lying supine for any of the functions that you are going to do. So these are the few things that you have to sort of address. And this is uh, so there are assessment tools which are there, and the environment has to be generally a familiar environment because they don't work well with an unfamiliar environment. Tools are like small boxes for hand-eye coordination and reflecting toys. Now this FVA kit consists of 14 tools, but there are 24 items in these where you have where you can improve a contrast, a spotting, improve peripheral vision, improve hand-eye coordination. You get the concept of size, colors, and shapes, and it helps scanning and coordination. And in these you have things like smileys, you have shapes, shape board, you have size board, you have a color board, you have match the color sheets, you have number cutouts, you have alphabet cutouts, you have four balls in different contrasts, and black and white cloth, a rope, a functional vision assessment record sheets are there, in which you kind of signify how many the child was able to sort of do well and not do well. Now, the function of these special children, the visual function, is you cannot do it by normal standards. So, these children, the behavior of these children is done by what we call as ethological observation. Now, this ethological observation involves looking at the child's vision or gaze avoiding, if there is a change of posture, there's smiling, the blinking of eyes, facial expressions, and stereotypic behavior. You have to make a note of all these things. And there are certain visual behaviors which tell you that if the child avoids looking, chaotic eye movements, faking, overlooking, head shaking, squeezing the eyes because of photophobia, all these things tell you that there is a great degree of visual dysfunction. So, to answer the query, how much can my child see? This is a very concerned question by the parents. You can do this test by a combination of what you call a PLT and a fixation, that is a preferential looking technique, and the visual function battery, which comprises of PL with orientation, follow a Maddox rod, OKN, grab toys and objects, grab red objects, and an obstacle course. And a point of point 3 in these will show you a child who is capable of independent ambulation. Since I'm out of town, I'm just going to run through the next slides. Nystagmus and OKN also gives you a measure. This is the number of tools which are there. This and you use movement, high contrast technology, multiple consistent approaches. And what is the this that children with CVI like bright colors, they are light gazers, they third of them are photophobic, they have what is called as a crowding phenomenon, as a result of which they look at an object when they grab it, but when they are moving away they look away from it. And there is always a visual field preference, and they have a preference to look at familiar objects. So you do a retinoscopy for these children to get their numbers, and you can use any of these toys, illuminated objects, or animal sounds, and you mummify the child when before checking it out. And what you have to do, you have to do the refractions for these people, give them the proper numbers, and then you have to give them all their rehabilitations. So if you see this child who's walking after some time, you see the child is not looking up, not attentive, but the difference when you make the child wear the glasses. This is another autistic child who was till 12 years not given glasses. She was like this. And then see the difference in her once the glasses are given. She looks at an object and tries to hold it. This is another child who had both visual and auditory issues. He was very, he used to look at bizarre odd movements. He was autistic. And once he was given glasses, he became receptive. He came towards me, he bowed out and he went, and he was smiling all the time. So these are all the situations. This is another child where the child was babbling. This was actually a shaken baby, and this is how the child presented. But this child is now capable of independent ambulation. Another CP child who has done well. This is a learning disability child, and all these children do well. Stem cells have come in a big way, because we find that along with the stem cells, when you give them the glasses, they are much more better rehabilitated than otherwise. And midbrain stimulations also work in children who have low vision to very good vision, because you can help the stimulate the memory. And these people, without just, it is not braille, they touch the object, they know the color, they know what is written. This is because of the pineal stimulation. Visual rehab which is done. And finally, the tenets are that when these children come to you, see that they are rehabilitated, always do their refraction at 6 months. And in DVM, because of CVI, refer early, because this is a lifeline to visual maturation and development. Thank you so much, and thank you for the extra time. Okay, can we go over to Anisha? Anisha, you're doing both of yours in continuity, right?
Is my screen visible?
Yeah, your screen is visible. Anisha is a pediatric ophthalmologist, and she's going to talk to us on ROP associated with autism, cerebral palsy, and learning disorders, and also on ADD and ADHD.
Is my screen seen?
Yes, your screen is seen.
Uh, I can't see it over here.
Karobi ma'am, you need to unmute.
We can see you, we can't see your screen. Now we can see your screen.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Karobi ma'am. So my talk is related to ROP associated with autism, cerebral palsy, and learning disorders. So I'm going to cover the definitions, articles, evaluation, and case study. So as Madam has already discussed, the special children require not only a holistic, but a holistic approach, an entire pediatric team, along with the vision therapist for these children. So autistic spectrum disorders is a heterogeneous group of developmental disorders characterized by qualitative impairments in communication, social relations, repetitive and restrictive behaviors in the interests. As described in ROP, with ROP have a higher incidence of association with autistic spectrum disorders, learning disorders, and cerebral palsy. There is a loss of autoregulation of the cerebral circulation, which results in the hypoperfusion of the watershed regions between the hemispheres. So this is an article which had stated about the power and promise identifying the highlights related to the biological markers persisting to autism spectrum disorders, and the red flags which were seen in autistic children, where the evaluation of the child is done by no pointing or pointing by the gestures of 12 months, no single words which are being expressed by the child by 16 months, that is a delay in the developmental milestones. So children who are blind due to ROP are at an increased risk of severe developmental disturbances. They have a risk of mental retardation, CP, and autism. So normal intelligence with a few behavioral deviations and no clinical signs of brain dysfunction, the symptoms may result from loss of vision and adaptive behavior, that is blindisms. So there have been quite a few studies which have described a relation between autism spectrum disorders in survivors of extreme prematurity, and hence in children of ROP, post-ROP evaluation or post-ROP treatment, they have to have a long-term follow-up to rule out all these spectrum of disorders that can be associated with that. Now, as per a study done by Dr. Karubi Lahiri and her team, somehow I'm not able to see the screen. There was a certain percentage of pervasive developmental disorders which we had seen in our clinic. And based on that, we found out that as per the pervasive developmental disorders, the types are, there could be autism with or without cerebral palsy, there could be Asperger's syndrome, there could be childhood degenerative disorders, Rett syndrome. They get detected by 3 years of age, though it can start earlier. So as per our study, we found about 68% of children with autism with 4% of Asperger's. Then comes learning disability. So in learning disability, there is a problem with the speech development. These children can go to school and do well in schools. There is a lot of improvement seen in these children with speech if proper glasses are given. The glasses can be given earliest at 2 months of age. They may have difficulties in visual reading, writing, and difficulties in performing daily activities. But if the glasses are given, they do pretty well. Now, extremely preterm children are a higher risk of having neurodevelopmental delays, behavioral problems, social difficulties, and impairments of executive problems. It affects more of children who have very low birth weight or or who are born extreme preterm. Now, how do we evaluate them? As already discussed by Dr. Karobi ma'am, was through the pediatrician, through the pediatric evaluation, a neurological evaluation, the neuromotor evaluation, hearing, vision, cognitive, and motor evaluation. So this is a table showing the social interaction, communication, and range of movements in different types of pervasive developmental disorders associated with ROP, who can have the varied presentations. So pervasive development disorder has a cause and effect. So there is a evidence of postnatal infection-driven inflammation in these children. Sometimes exposure to heavy metal smoking can also cause pervasive developmental disorder. And there is a risk of autism spectrum disorders also there in preterms. So as per our study, I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the screen over here. I don't know what technical problem is there. So how do we do an evaluation of these children is by cycloplegic refraction. We can atropinize them for 3 days, followed by retinoscopy in pre-verbal children, and the glasses can be prescribed at 6 months of age. So this is the percentage of children who had worn the glasses and the remaining who had not worn the glasses. This video was already shown by Dr. Karobi ma'am, how the child was doing well post glasses. Without glasses, she was disoriented, but as soon as the moment she got the glasses, she started performing well. Now in visual behaviors, there's a lot of avoiding chaotic eye movements, faking, overlooking, head shaking, squeezing lids due to photophobia. And the signs which we are supposed to look out for when these children are not giving us vision, when they walk in the clinic, are good eye contact, fixation, and following, which means there is a good functional vision. And if you want to rule out a bad visual dysfunction, you have to look out for wandering eye movements, nystagmus, and tonic gaze preference. Now the question is, how much can my child see? So the different tests which Madam just described was to look for preferential looking test and visual function battery, which was already described. And visual acuity measurement can also be done with optokinetic nystagmus drum. Behavioral elements in developmental children, it helps in the correction of visual functions, it helps in the proprioceptive sensations, neck holding, truncal balance, sitting in place, and walking are the important elements which are supposed to be seen. The take-home message is all preterms need to have a refraction at 6 months of age. All delayed visual maturation children due to CVI need to be referred early. And all of this in their lifeline is very important for their visual maturation development. I'll share the second talk.
Go ahead.
My second talk is related to ophthalmic abnormalities in dyslexia, ADD, or ADHD. So problem with the screen. So, is it not good? So dyslexia, or specifically a reading disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder in 5 to 15% of school-going children with functional disruption in neural systems. It is a genetically inherited disorder. They have intact learning and vision and conventional schooling. Persistent difficulties are there in learning to read efficiently despite normal intelligence. They have a habit of skipping lines while reading aloud, making repeated spelling mistakes. The common ocular manifestations are refractive errors, strabismus, which is more common, are exodeviations, and amblyopia. Now, they have a phenomena called as Mern-Island syndrome, where these children experience visual distortions or what we call as a visual stress. They are seeing letters moving on the page. There's blurring or forming strange patterns, spatial distortions, frequent blinking, losing one's place on the page, and headache. Now, as per the study by Creatin et al., they had found and reported certain findings between dyslexia and ocular manifestations. And according to them, the most prominent features were they had poor stereo acuity and poor sensory near vision with convergence insufficiency and poor accommodation. And 80% of these dyslexic children had normal ophthalmic function in each of the tests employed. So the visual acuity was less affected in 80% of these children, although refractive errors is one of the prominent features. A convergence, the type of exodeviation which was more prominently seen was the convergence type of exodeviation with a low accommodative convergence to accommodative ratio. So as per the study done by Prado et al., the visual attention span in these children was less and it was reduced. So visual attention span is the amount of distinct visual elements processed in parallel in multi-element array. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is synonymous with attention deficit disorder, the only difference being the hyperactivity. It is a type of neurodevelopmental and impulsive behavioral disorder, which is seen in 5 to 15% of school-going children. There is functional disruption in neural systems. It is genetically inherited. Again, refractive errors, strabismus, exodeviations are more common with convergence insufficiency. And there is a tendency of penetrating eye injuries in these children because of attention behavior. They want to grab attention of people. In attention deficit disorder, there is no type of hyperactivity at all. It is another type of inattentive type of ADHD. ADHD has three types: primarily inattentive, primarily hyperactive, and both combined. So there is a difference between a typical brain and an ADHD brain. An ADHD brain is hyperactive, engaging, unorganized, confusing, creative, restless, compared to the neurotypical brain. So the ocular findings in patients with attention deficit and hyperactivity is that the contrast sensitivity levels and the nasal quadrant retinal nerve fiber layer thickness were lower as per this study. Hence, whenever these patients are given vision therapy for any purpose or whenever they are using any form of toys, we have to make sure that the tools that they are using have more of contrast. There is another interesting study which stated that there is an increased pupil dilation which is seen in happy faces in children with hyperactive or impulsive symptoms of ADHD. Visual fields, Martin et al. Showed that there is a better visual acuity and visual field outcome with stimulants. So children with ADHD are treated with certain drugs like Adderall, and they showed a better outcome in their visual acuity and visual field with the medications. The fundus appearance in these children showed small disc to rim development, disturbed development because of disturbed neurovascular tissue development. There is a strong association between ADHD and dry eye. So Adderall and Ritalin have been known to cause dry eye. So whenever we have children being referred to us for ADHD, we need to do a dry eye evaluation. We need to ask the duration, how long they have been on these drugs, because there is a tendency of development of dry eye on a long-term basis. Again, in children who present to us with Tourette syndrome, where there is eye blinking, facial grimacing, head jerking, hand clapping, these children have a lot of comorbid association with ADHD, which is up to 50%. So the pearls are that it is where refractive errors are most commonly seen in these children. Hence, correct glass prescription and strabismus correction helps with the behavioral disorders and dyslexia, making them more quieter and more attentive. Penetrative eye injuries are seen in 1 out of 2 children with behavioral disorders. Hence, these children need to be watched out and treated accordingly and with the specialist as required. Children with vision problems can be wrongly diagnosed as ADHD and can invite medical legal troubles. Hence, one has to be very, very careful. The principles for vision therapy are for improving focusing, for giving the vision therapy are to improve the focusing, tracking, depth perception, and eye-hand coordination. Although they are not of much use, but they can be tried. Toys and tools with high contrast should be given in children with ADHD and ADD. And visual fields and fundus picture and OCT of the macula and retinal nerve fiber layer and dry eye evaluation should be considered for children of ADHD and ADD. Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha. That was a very nice, precise, and lovely talk given by you on this subject matter. I now invite Himika to present to give us her presentation. Himika, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Hi. Good evening, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, Anisha. Okay, has talked.
Himika is a pediatric ophthalmologist, and her specialty is retinoblastoma and neurodevelopmental issues of children. So she's going to talk to us about no vision or low vision, eye checkup versus visual rehab in these cases.
Hi. Good evening to everyone. Uh, I don't know how to go ahead. See, this seems to be stuck. Let me try again.
Or escape, go into the this, and
Somebody
then you
else
can.
is sharing, is it?
It's sharing, yes.
Someone else is sharing.
I had shared. I thought I had to share so that you will do it.
No, no, you.
Yeah. Start now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so thanks a lot for this opportunity. And I'd like to acknowledge my previous institutes from where I learned a lot. So let's start with some maths. We've done a lot of science. I thought we'd just change the flavor a bit. Equation number one, low vision is not no vision. And equation number two, visual acuity testing is not functional visual assessment. That has already been like discussed quite elaborately. And the third equation is we need to look at how to approach a child with low vision and really change our outlook. Another alarming statistics continuing with the concept of maths is blind schools in India. So, unfortunately, only 25% of the children in the blind schools actually deserve to be in that blind school. Rest 75%, in fact, are not even blind, they have visual impairment. So, that is like an alarm, and that's one thing that we should change in due course of time in India. So referring someone to blind school blindly is not a grand idea, and that's not really what visual rehab is all about. So just to touch upon some definitions without being repetitive, any form of uncorrectable visual loss after the medical and surgical management has completed is low vision, and it interferes with the daily activity of the child. Okay, and when we try to rehabilitate this child, there are we generally try to look for solutions to their problems. We might not be able to achieve 6 N6 in every child, but we want to find some answers. For example, this gentleman doesn't have hands, but he wants to paint. So he has utilized his legs to paint. This famous dancer wanted to dance, but her feet were not with her. So it was replaced, and she has that famous Jaipur foot. So the rehab concept really depends on compensating, restoring, and replacing. And there are various techniques like home based, computer based, office based, and then utilizing various optical or non optical devices. When we approach a child with low vision, like already discussed, we need to assess in a very customized fashion, then train and prescribe. So this is really a scenario which happens in many places. Fortunately, I think we are the only speakers around, so all of us know about this. This is more of preaching to the converted. But yeah, when we look at a child with cerebral palsy, ROP, or any other disorders like ADHD, they have multiple problems, not just the eye problem or not just the neurological issue. These are some more statistics which tell us that the chances of getting refractive error or strabismus is much higher in a cerebral palsy child rather than a non-disabled or a regular pediatric patient. Also, what we need to see here is in a CVI child, there is 50% chance that apart from the eye problems, he or she will have multiple disabilities versus a ROP child where it's going to be more or less purely ocular problems and with a few others. So what do we do when the child can't talk or read? And how can we test the vision? And we must remember, especially for brain tumor patients also, that visual acuity and visual field is not the end of story. There's much more that can be done. So it all starts when the child comes in, the way they maintain eye contact, the way they interact, then the kind of speech pattern that they have. It's a good idea to know which medications they are on, because that has a bearing, its side effects also. We use this VFQ questionnaire a lot. And what I found was that when the patients are waiting outside, when the parents are waiting outside, they are occupied also, and their thoughts are organized. So the first time a patient comes to us, we encourage them to fill this visual functional questionnaire, which can be downloaded, and there's no royalty or any other restrictions to its utilization. And then it has multiple questions like these, and it's very objective. One word of advice: the doctor who's finally seeing the patient should not be making them do this questionnaire. So the receptionist outside or the optometrist who is working with you would be a good person, or a therapist would be a good person to go through all this. So once we have this, we get a full idea, we get a reasonably good idea of what kind of problem they are looking at and how severe is the condition. It also asks questions about their other general health. So, you know, like if a child is, say, bedridden, then you know that you can't call them in maybe twice a week or thrice a week for visual stimulation, and you want to give a home-based regimen for them. So it gives you a rough idea. Even before the child walks in, you have a fair idea of what's happening. Visual acuity in pediatric age group can be tested by multiple techniques, and we won't go into details of that. Now, sometimes it's not just the acuity. Like for this picture, can you identify what it is? Anisha, you want to answer? Sorry. Okay, so sometimes, you know what, these patients need some visual enhancement. Okay, so it's a very, so it's a cow. So
I need a visual enhancement.
Me too.
So this is just a catch. So it's for people, normally sighted people like us, to understand that this is how a child with, say, CVI or one of the low vision situations perceives things. You know, he or she can see, but he can't make it out. But if you give them that little bit of a push, then they'll perform better. So that's why we have to look into stereopsis, contrast, and visual field, and other tests, not just the acuity. Again, like you both told us and the rest of the people always say, we have to look at familiar objects and attractive ones, and customize and try to show them what they like to see. So for example, this child, we start with a football. When the child comes for the first time, the parents say kuch bhi nahi dekhta ya nahi dekhta. You know, sometimes we have those vague presentation. We start with a lighted object like a red rope light in a dark room. Then when the child responds, then we go to a lighted room, and we sometimes might show them a non-illuminated object, and then reduce the size of the object based on the child's response. So again, it should not look like a very formal clinic based evaluation. It should look like more of a play area kind of a scenario. Nowadays, during the pandemic lockdown, we also have started like doing one session, one physical session, first session, with a low vision kit that we give to the parents, and then the rest of the sessions we either do online, or certain parents who can't come, we email them the PDF version of black and white stimulatory images. Although we are not sure that the printouts will be 100% contrast, but something is better than nothing. So we have customized, and even when we do the one-to-one session, we encourage the patients to take a video of us or our therapist, so that they can go home and repeat the session at home in a similar fashion. Certain tips are: good idea to do binocular. Don't occlude their eye immediately. They really get irritated. Don't forget near acuity. Many of them have accommodation issues also. Obviously, a low vision child takes a lot of time. He's not your 5 minutes in, 5 minutes out patient. Music helps to ease out the, ease them out and make them less cranky. Another good trick that we like to follow is test the parents first, do the visual acuity and some of the tests on the parents, and once the child feels reassured, then he or she will cooperate better. Targets have to be attractive. It gives me a very good opportunity to still keep looking at new toys in the market because I have this excuse. And don't use cell phones as torchlight. You try using it on your own eyes, it's quite irritating. So it's a good idea to have the typical flashlight, the conventional one, rather than the cell phone's light. Again, for functional visual assessment, this was already discussed, but based on the vision score and the kind of response the child is giving, we customize the therapy and try to give the child stimulation. And later on, when the child is big enough and able to come to us regularly, then vision training is given. We use a lot of optical devices and magnifying devices. Also, what is used a lot is contrast enhancement using these amber color spectacles. Then illumination, sometimes something like a simple table lamp helps the child a lot, and various forms of magnifiers. This is obviously an adult, but what we are using is a stand magnifier. Then based on the patient's capacity and the household condition, you may or may not give them something which requires electricity or which is too complicated. So a lot depends on what are the patient's requirements, and that's why the questionnaire really comes to our rescue. We also record the profession of the patient. Sometimes we have adults, because so most of the children are either special children or they are students, but then what form of reading they need to do. For example, this is an electronic device. Again, here I have demonstrated it for an adult. Now, this is a case example of a child in sixth standard. He's a brain tumor survivor, and his vision was compromised post tumor surgery. He was advised to shift to blind school due to low vision. So what we did was that we did a functional evaluation and asked him to come back with his textbooks, and we tried simple magnifiers. So the spectacle mounted magnifiers, the prismatic ones, they were more than enough for him to read his textbooks. And more than the child, it was his elder brother in 8th standard who was overjoyed that my younger sibling doesn't have to change school. So what we want to say is that the impact on pediatric age group, visual rehab and functional assessment, the impact is intense, because it's not just being able to read or not being able to read, it is the ability to be in mainstream. And every human being on this planet wants to remain in mainstream. They don't want that exclusion or that label of being, special or different. Okay. It also opens up a lot more educational and vocational opportunities and hobbies, and sometimes it overall avoids handicap. So as clinicians, it's very important that we force almost our patients to try to fight to remain in the mainstream school, because their chance, although it is tough, it's an uphill job in the beginning, and all schools may not respond in the same fashion. Sometimes we have to fight it out, but if we are able to put the child in mainstream, the long term impact and outcome is much better for these kind of children. Again, to remind, so only 25% of the children, this is from these are statistics from our own country, only 25% of the children in blind school actually deserve to be in blind school. Rest of them are simply visually impaired, and they should actually have been in mainstream, which means that really we have a long way to go. And I think as clinicians, other clinicians should be more aware of rehab and do appropriate referrals. It's no longer the situation where we don't have rehab centers in India. It's about awareness amongst clinicians to do appropriate referral. Nowadays, we also use a lot of computer-based vision therapy to enhance the peripheral vision and improve the reflex times. It's used in normally sighted sports personnel also. And like my previous speaker said, that when a child with multiple disability comes to us, it has to be a multi-pronged approach and not just a one-man show or just the eye clinic trying to take care of the refraction and visual findings. So that's why the concept of early intervention centers is encouraged for children with developmental delay and disabilities, looking at physical, cognitive, communication, social and emotional well-being of the child. And in all this, vision is of paramount importance, because vision is the most important sensory input. To conclude, we want to remember that low vision, partially sighted, is not blind, it's not no vision. Functional visual assessment is important. Visual rehabilitation, though takes time, takes patience, gives very gratifying results. And if we take those pains and that time, we will have a lifelong positive impact on the child's future. Thank you for a patient listening.
Thank you, Himika. That was a very nice talk where you highlighted a very important point that 75% of the people who are sent to blind schools need not be, they just require visual rehabilitation, which is such a breather for the parents because it's a very bad thing to know that your child has to go and learn in blind school.
Braille, yeah. So they actually are so partially sighted that they don't have to learn Braille. They just
Yeah.
need some visual enhancement.
Yeah. Can you stop sharing your screen? I now invite Dr. Anand Vinekar. He requires no introduction. He's our ROP man from Narayanan Israel, doing so well. And now he's getting into visual rehab also with all the children around him. So let's hear his talks both on the OCT findings and on visual rehab. Over to you, Anand.
Thank you, Dr. Karoubi, and good evening, everybody, to this last session of the first virtual AIOS. I have these two talks, so I'm going to do them one after another. They're not sort of related, but we'll see how. Well, OCT, as Dr. Karoubi mentioned, is something that VR people can't live without. I mean, we know we do it day in and day out for adults. But for children, it's been rather hard because of the limitation of the technology that was available. You either had to put babies into these positions or you had to dismantle an adult OCT to make it handheld. But since the availability of the handheld OCT, things have changed. This is a normal OCT of an adult male. Could be female as well, but this is an adult, and we all are familiar with that. But if you look at a OCT of an infant, and this particular picture, the baby is born preterm, then you notice that there are certain differences. And these are important to understand because we're going to try to correlate that with CVI. So firstly, this outer plexiform layer, which is moving straight here, there is a gap between that and the inner limiting membrane. So there are inner retinal layers that have not disappeared. The other changes are, we'll see them as we go on, is the ellipsoid zone, or what used to be called the ISOS, or the photoreceptor layer, is either depleted or is present but is attenuated. Now, train your eyes on the two vertical blue arrows that you will see in every successive slide. They're going to come towards each other. So this shows you that the ellipsoid zone, or the ISOS, is going to come towards each other, which means it is beginning to grow as the baby grows older. This is a preterm baby born and postnatally at 42 weeks, 46 weeks, 47 weeks. And that's when it becomes a bifid layer or a two layer. This basically means that all preterm babies are not born with all layers, and it starts happening after a few weeks or few months. But what's really important is, can we correlate any of these OCT events with vision? So that was part of what we've been doing here. And this summary on top, the table on top, shows you that there are certain layers, and these were all compared in all preterm babies, some who had ROP and some who didn't. And we found that ROP actually delayed some of these layers, although ophthalmoscopically their maculas looked normal. So they looked like they had a normal retina, and they were all, in fact, in this group, some of them had not even received treatment, but they had these layer abnormalities. So to summarize what they had abnormal, they had the inner retinal layer fusion not happening, a late development, arrival of the external limiting membrane, and the ISOS that we saw. And we correlated that every 3 months up to 1, and now even 1.5 years. I think Dr. Karoubi spoke about how Downs is also part of the CVI spectrum. We started seeing a lot of patients with Downs, and we were interested in examining their OCTs. And what we found here is that even the older Downs child, who is more than 2, 4, 8, 10 years old, had these persistent changes in the OCT that mimicked a preterm baby. And while these changes mimicked a term baby under 2 years, after 2 years of age, the Down's children seem to have persistence of the abnormal layers, whereas the term controls, who are non-Down's children, they started developing the normal layers. So this again mimics what is happening in their neuroanatomy, and we know that the tangles and all the changes that happen in the CNS actually worsen after the age of 2. So in a strange and interesting way, what we are noticing in the inner retina is actually mimicking what is happening in the brain as well. Now, while we were looking at these preterm babies and trying to image their ridge, we sort of almost serendipitously walked into this finding here, where we found a macular edema of prematurity. We were the first group to report that. So at that time, there was no nomenclature. So we decided to classify it as 2 patterns. In pattern A, there was a complete disruption of the foveal dip. And in pattern B, there were these foveal and parafoveal hyporeflective spaces in the inner retina. And the B picture on the right are the same babies after a few weeks spontaneously resolving. These were not treated in any form, not even with topical drops to sort of reduce the edema. And it turns out that it just could be a physiological variation of inner retinal changes. But then what's really interesting is this pattern B, which is not just the foveal or the subfoveal hyporeflective spaces, but the parafoveal as well, started, and the Duke group was the first to report that. They correlated that form of edema with cortical vision impairment. Coming back to our own cohort, we followed up these babies, the ones who had the edema, ones who did not have the edema, and ones who did not have ROP. And we found that those who had the edema, even though it was transient, did have vision delays, and we were checking this using Teller equity and comparing it with the age-matched nomogram. They did have a drop in vision, which only made up by the end of 1 and 1.5 years. Now, coming back to the Downs and the CVI syndrome, this is a very famous lecture by Gail Morton, where he says that no child in his large career of looking at these children has ever had a 20/20 vision, despite having corrected refraction, amblyopia correction, and even normal macula. What's really important then is, are we looking at these subclinical changes now picked up on the OCT, maybe down the line on the OCTA? Are we looking at subclinical changes in these babies that can actually explain why their vision is so-called not 20/20, or is it part of the CVI spectrum? So OCT, we have now moved on to examining a whole lot of spectrum in foveal hypoplasias with syndromes, MPPC syndromes, IP, rubella, infections, tumors, and so on. And the important thing is correlating it with their systemic findings. So this is the Duke finding, where they've correlated the pattern B-like parafoveal hyporeflective changes and the supra-OPL outer plexiform layer hyporeflective changes with, in this case, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. And these are the patterns of edema that have been shown. And these are, as you can see, distinct and different from the ones we found in the macular edema of prematurity, which is more exactly subfoveal, and there is a disruption, and that's that on the right. There's a disruption of the foveal dip, and it looks like cystoid macular edema that we are so often see in adults after surgery or inflammation or uveitis. So there are these patterns now, and this is being correlated with MRI findings in the brain, both for hypoglycemia, for birth asphyxia, for hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. And this is to summarize the changes that you find in changes in OCT with HI and those that are not with HI. We have been using OCT, for example, here in this case, where children have get referred back to us from our pediatric ophthalmic colleagues who have tried everything possible for the amblyopia management to see if their vision improves. And when we look at their OCT, they just have these photoreceptor changes. They don't have dystrophies. Here's another example. One eye moves to 6/6, the other eye does not improve despite patching for a 7-year-old with 6/18. And then look how different their OCTs are. Look at the outer retina, look at the ellipsoid zone, how thin and attenuated that is. We don't know the cause of why this happens, but these subclinical changes might be able to explain what we are seeing. So that's as far as the OCT part of the talk is. Coming to the CVI therapy, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Lia Hyväräinen, the inventor of the LIA tools and everything that, and she's been mentoring our program at Narayan Nethralaya, and Dr. Namita Jacob from Chennai, and our own faculty, Pooja Sarbajna, who is our lead CVI therapist and CVI specialist. Dr. Karobi and others have covered the anatomy, so I'm really going to move out of that and try to go directly to how we classify in terms of for therapy. So this is just math, 2 standard deviations if it's under 1 stream, 2 stream, which means a motor, fine motor, a sensory, and so on. And then to majorly as ophthalmologists and as clinicians, we want to differentiate delayed visual maturation with cortical vision impairment. So even in DVM, there's something that will improve with the natural history, and some that will take a little longer and may even have defects. So that's our job to, and the best way to check that out is the functional vision assessment that Dr. Himika and Dr. Anisha spoke about. So where we want to point out in simple words is there a problem in the child figuring out where the object is or what the object is? So the ventral stream, dorsal stream, terminology is not important, but if the child can look at, locate the object or figure out the object in terms of the spatial orientation, these are 2 distinct things, and there are of course tests and ways of doing that, and that will sort of give us a clue on where we need to take this baby in terms of management. So these are children from Dr. Namita's center, and then I'll share some from our own. These are children who have a lot of motor developmental delay, neck control abnormal. And so you have to start by assessing what they can see and what orientation they can see. And then of course they improve right from motor skills, because vision is so important, especially in the first 2 years. They say about 80 to 85% of all other milestones are dependent on how vision improves and progresses. So how do you identify the CVI child in your clinic? Well, vision is variable, peripheral, moving objects are much seen better than stationary. Color vision may be normal. Photophobia, as Dr. Karobi mentioned, about a good 1/3 of them are. They have a problem with depth perception, reaching out to objects. And of course, they're uncomfortable in social gathering, and they have a problem with crowding or clutter confusion. Very, very important in our setting seems to be hypoglycemia, even more than birth asphyxia, which is seen in the West, and seizures and others infections are there. So what we assess here is that, and probably this is one of my most important slides, in terms of history, the poor eye contact, staring at lights, poor visual inattention, tripping, cannot locate objects on the floor, finding it, for the older child, finding it difficulty to copy from the board, and so on. And everyone's put up these slides on how it has to be a holistic approach in terms of doing right from the tests that we do. And these are quick pictures to show you how all of these parameters are tested in our outpatient. And then, of course, after the assessment is done, one has to figure out what form of therapy is best required. So this is, for example, a baby who underwent ROP surgery for advanced ROP and had very little anatomical remnant of an attached retina. And this is Professor Leah herself in our center, who was assessing that child to figure out which is that field of vision, field of view that the child can be worked on. And using these parameters where we are assessing them before and after, we are able to make a very big change, not only in their vision, but also in their other milestones. I'm going to just quickly forward this. These are basically the video of all the skills that I showed you, and this is how the assessment is done. And we are all using the LIA tools, right, from contrast to depth to visual field. All of that is assessed using the LIA tools. And once that is done, and you can see this child's behavior, movement in the clinic and so on, has so drastically improved. So let me quickly now go to the important subgroups have been spoken about, and we know that that is a, so yeah, so this is how we would manage these babies in terms of where they fit in. Since the pandemic, we have also started online therapies. So as Dr. Himika said, the first session is with us. In fact, the first 2 or 3 sessions are with us. And then after that, there are group therapy sessions and solo, depending on the age group. And they're all connected with our vision therapy and vision rehab specialists. And we are now helping to make them do these therapies and then come once in about 4 to 6 weeks for reassessment, and then to decide whether they need to be moved up or require other therapies. In our center, we also have the speech therapist, the occupational therapist, the physiotherapist, a cognition specialist, and a pediatric neurologist, all on the same floor. And we're fortunate that we are now being able to provide a sort of holistic, as Dr. Karoubi mentions, approach under one roof. And we hope that after the pandemic, this will become, we're trying to integrate with schools. As rightly mentioned, integrating it with inclusive education is becoming a challenge. And we have to work not just with the NGOs, but also with the government to make that happen. This is the summary of the principles and the therapy that we do that was published in Dr. Azad's paper recently. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Anand. That was a completely different concept with your OCT, and also a very informative paper on the rehab that you are carrying out at NN. I just wanted to ask you one question, is that since they have, you have seen on the OCT that there are changes in the intraretinal fluids, there are cysts over there. Do you think any form of therapy would help these children with their vision?
So we've actually, the earliest age we've picked up the edema is about 48 to 50 weeks corrected age. The vision, we routinely assess children at the third corrected month. I think before that, we've not checked vision because we don't think it's reliable enough, even though we're using the Teller Equity. In terms of the macular edema, getting treated, almost all of them spontaneously resolved in about 4 to 6 weeks. That, the peak was between 37 and 40 weeks of corrected age and went away by the 50th or 52nd week. And since 52nd week or the third month was when we were checking vision, it's hard to say whether if we treated it before that, did it make a difference? And this was right in the beginning when we followed them up. And at that time, of course, we did not, in our original cohort of children, the one that was the follow-up that was published in IGO, we did not correlate that with CVI because we had no idea that that had a correlation. And it's an interesting thing that perhaps many of the parafoveal babies may have had a CVI component, because we know how many of these ROP babies have CVI associated. So it's a good question, and I think we can start by, although we've spoken to other groups who've seen this edema now even in term babies, and they don't treat it, with the exception of edema seen after laser therapy. Dr. Subina has shown that at VRSI. She treats it, and I think we all treat with topical steroids after giving laser, but then that's a different rationale.
Okay. Because it's an interesting concept that where you are finding in CVI children, and that's probably the reason for the amblyopia and the vision not getting restored to its final status. So do you think that an OCT should be mandatory for every child of CVI? Do you feel that in retrospect, after whatever you'll have studied, it's a good idea to do it?
I think it's a very good idea to do it, but I don't think it would be mandatory. Well, it's much easier and much cheaper to do than an MRI. So much easier to do than an MRI. And MRI is what our pediatric neurology colleagues will want, especially in hypoglycemia and birth asphyxia, to look at PVL and occipital cortex changes. Also, what in Karnataka, at least, consanguinity is very high, and we've seen many coexisting retinal dystrophies along with these cases. So why that's important is when we're looking at the inner retina for the edematous changes, we're looking at photoreceptors that are either attenuated or completely absent. And we don't know now, because we know that it takes a little longer for the ellipsoid zone to grow in these preterm babies. But 4 months later, 6 months later, when you are repeating these, then you find that the ellipsoid zone has not grown. And then you make a point of that and say, and you think, suspect retinal dystrophy as they grow older, and they don't have any other retinal findings. No vascular attenuation, no pigment dispersal in the periphery, and family history is vague, except the fact that there's consanguinity. So that spectrum, with the slide that I put about the spectrum, exactly is to tell you that we moved from just using it as a research tool to looking at babies with unexplained vision loss. And that was the two examples that I tried to show. My pediatric ophthalmic colleagues send us patients almost every week where they've sort of done their best with very good compliance of the child having been treated for amblyopia, good spectacle correction, good patching, all of that, and simply vision not improving. And then when you do the OCT, there's so many things we pick up, including CVI, subtle versions, but yes.
So, so you mean in case of unexplained vision loss in pediatric age group, it will be a very useful tool.
Yes, I think in our group, it was almost 20% of babies who were referred to us for OCT. And I'm talking about from centers outside us also, colleagues who send in patients for OCT. They are for unexplained vision loss. Yeah, not something, not to document what is there, but try to look for something that we don't know why it's there.
No, in this, I'd like to also make one comment, Anand, that see, when these children come to us, I mean, they might be coming to the institutes, they have been labeled as children who have not improved, or, they are amblyopic from a particular cause, you do the OCT, etc. But also, credibility for the fact has to be given at what age the child was given glasses, what is the degree of amblyopia that has already set in, how much of therapy has been given, and for how long. Because the thing is that contrary to what people feel, that amblyopia therapy is a very quick therapy, normally what we see is that for one line improvement, provided giving all the kinds of exercises, it takes proper one line improvement over 6 months to occur. So say if a child has got 4 lines of vision, we are looking at 2 years. We are not looking at something less. So if somebody tries for 5-6 months and this says that no, this child is not improving, that's not the way it is. And secondly, how religiously the child has been doing it, because when these amblyopia exercises have to be given, the child out of 6 months has to do it for 5 months, 5.5 months regularly. Only then they show an improvement. So all these factors also come into this, and this is also an added thing, because if they do it properly and yet they don't, and we get these findings on OCT, then we can say that that's the standstill. It cannot improve beyond that. You have any comments to this, Anand or Himika or Anisha?
I have a question, just a query for Anand sir. Sir, whenever you have been doing OCTs for macula, have you ever encountered seeing a patient who had APROP, in whom before doing the laser, you did a OCT for macula? Post laser, there was a suspected macular edema. You again did a OCT for macula. And then at 6 months of age, when this child comes for follow-up, with whatever best possible way you were able to assess the vision, you again did a OCT for that. And apparently it turned out that the child had developed CVI. Have you ever encountered any case in your previous study like that? Changes in the macula, which you could see in APROP in the macula?
No, not immediately before and after APROP, we don't have OCTs, mainly because, as you can imagine, the APROP child is really tiny, and the pupils are small, the media is hazy. We've tried immediately after. I was more interested in looking at inflammation in the vitreous after laser, actually, to tell you honestly. And at that time, we were not even looking for edema. So we've tried OCT just after laser, just before laser, to compare inflammation. But no, we've not. I mean, what you're saying is very nice if one can show that in a timeline, because then one can prove that it was normal before and then went on to develop that, and then could correlate it with the severity of ROP. But no, I've not had that kind of experience, and I've not read any publication like that as well. But it's a good thought.
You were saying something, Himika?
Yeah, I had a doubt. So basically, I wanted to know, especially during in the lockdown and all, and means how do you work hard to get these kids in mainstream education? The past 4-5 years that I've been doing it in Bombay, uh, it's quite tough, especially children outside Mumbai. Uh, Sometimes the headmaster doesn't even read the letters that we give.
I know.
So, and special educators, I know some NGOs over here, but the moment you talk of far-flung areas of Maharashtra and all, they just back out. So what are the strategies? Just wanted to know from
See,
you.
basically, even in the state of, even in Mumbai, like during the lockdown period, the therapists were not ready to go. Some of them did give them some homebound exercises which
Yeah, it
they
has
could
been
do for
quite
these
bad
children.
now.
Yeah, I mean, and even still now, there is quite a bit of restriction on how many children can attend. Many children are missing their physiotherapy sessions. The neurodevelopmental therapies which are going on are going for a toss. So, because the parents have got so much of work at home because of children remaining at home and everybody's working from home, that they really don't have time to concentrate on the exercise part of these children who need them very severely. And I really don't know how to tackle that problem, because it's a persistent problem, and some of them come back with slipbacks, not only in terms of their neurological impairments, but also in their amblyopic status, because when we have checked children, they have decreased by one line because they have not been exercising. So it's a major problem.
And
And the parents are overtaxed, so you really don't know how to push them. Any ideas, Anand or Himika, if
I completely agree because we've had the similar problem. In the first wave, we didn't push so much for the online therapy. We just believed that, first of all, we never thought it will take so long. And then when we started seeing loss of follow up because of the lockdown and during the unlock, and when they started coming back in September, October last year, we found there was a massive slippage. Some of them even had gone from 20 by 640 to 2700 on the tag. And of course, their other milestones were way low. And because the vision was so low, the parents had become very, they had a lot of despair, and then they'd given up. So when this
financial
Jan,
issues also. Many parents lost their jobs also.
I know.
so this January onwards, we sort of fine-tuned our online, and now we have sort of regained their confidence, saying that it may not be as good as coming to the hospital and doing the therapy, but something's better than the other thing. And one more thing that we did, and Pooja's team is responsible, is that in Karnataka we have a very famous town called Chenpatna, which makes these wooden toys. It's exported all over the world. So we went there and made low-cost toys using the principles of the Leah toys, and now we give them to the parents as kits. So they take it all the way to our rural centers. We are now trying to distribute this through the government as well.
Oh,
Uh,
wait.
Very good.
so, in fact, Dr.
Can
Arun
you
Singh has.
send me more information on that? I would be quite interested.
Sure, sure. So
Because
again, no paints. It's non-toxic, and it's inert and all of that. It's really good, and we're also giving
Chana are
employment.
very sturdy. See,
Right.
right now most of the kits either have plastic, or they are made of those cardboard paper with gelatin paper in it, and that becomes very soggy.
Yes.
And if we ask them to laminate it, then it gives a glare.
Correct.
So it's a
So these we went through a lot of them, and we started sending whatever prototypes we had to Dr. Leah, and this is a nice full kit now. We've not yet gone into mass production. It's made in small orders for our patients. But Dr. Arun Singh was asking about how we could team up with the RBSK to see if it is more universally available. So, and it also gives employment to our rural
Yes,
forces because
yes.
it's a small
Can you
scale.
send some photographs of those
That's what at
toys?
least
I
share
should have
photos.
actually put them in my presentation, but it's work in progress. But definitely.
Okay, okay. All right, all right. Because the thing is, that would be very interesting. This is similar to what toys we used to have in our younger days. Those red colored toys which used to come, they were wooden
Actually,
toys.
I use Channapatna toys for my kid because when I was in Narayana, we visited Channapatna for this reason.
So the colored ones are very good, but the cost went up, and we were really trying to keep it low cost. So we have just the natural color. We have not painted them.
That's very, very nice. And this, Himika, are there any kind of legal implications that you have seen in, if somebody has labeled a patient of low vision for no vision?
So there are 2, 3 types of direct legal implications I have not come across, and you both would know more. I think Anand sir and you, because of the years of practice. Um, I see 2 sets of parents. One who are in denial. So I realize that the entire Indian system has a lot of gray zones. So you can label them disabled and you can get away with a lot of things. Like without visual rehab, a person might come to up to 3 by 60, and once you give them magnification, they are even 6'9" or 6'18" after the magnification device. And so certain people prefer to have the low vision handicap certificate because that gives them a lot of perks, and certain section of parents are in denial, so they don't want to be labeled as disabled. So I saw equal mix of both, and I did not feel that education or economic status had anything to do with that. Meaning even somebody from a poor economic background who knew that the disability would give them, there are tax rebates, there is I think travel, chaperone gets yeah. So but even with that, some of the parents were in denial. They said we don't want to be labeled that, whereas there were some who had good vision and still they want that. In fact, a lot of, because I do oculoplasty, I remove a lot of eyes and retinoblastoma. So lot of parents sometimes sort of force us, although the child is one-eyed and has a 6/6 vision in that eye. Some parents really are interested in getting a disability certificate, which they don't qualify for if the eye is 6/6. So it's mixed. It's really mixed. But I have not come across anything on legal aspect. But what really hurts me is the condition of our blind schools.
And what about the psychological aspects of parents whose children require these exentrations for retinoblastoma?
So that is, yeah, that's a very different topic. What we face in India is, first of all, we faced a lot of abandonment and like denial and abandonment when you advise enucleation. So now what we started doing is right from the diagnosis, and this is a study, again, I'm yet to put it for publication. We did it 1 year ago, 2 years ago, sorry. We changed the strategy, and now we started sort of doing, when we first time break the diagnosis, we do it with the social worker. So we have the psychologist or the social worker with us, so that later on, initially we give chemo, we try eye salvage, but when the time comes, suppose the child is not responding to conservative techniques and needs the eye removal, we already have a social worker who has held their hands right from the beginning. So we do joint counseling for enucleation. Also, what I learned in 2 or 3 anecdotal cases is they go for alternate medicine. In fact, in the lockdown, they came back because that alternate medicine channels closed. Um, we do not have to be very critical. We have to underreact, and that's when they come back and finally, agree for enucleation. So more of a psychological game.
Too much time also. Anisha, are you there?
Yeah.
Anisha, there's just one question which I'd like to ask you. Just be a little more this about it. Explain to us about the penetrating injuries which you mentioned in the this attention ADHD children.
So in these children who have attention seeking abilities or attention seeking disorders, they like grabbing attention of family members towards them. Sometimes these children are from some families where there is a special child in the family who's getting more attention and they get less attention. So they want everybody to have more focus on them. So they try to do everything. So inflicting injuries can be on the body like a small cut, because they know the moment they get injured, they show it to their mother and the mother gives them attention. So at times they can even use pencils or what do you say, the compasses to make minor injuries to themselves. Unknowingly, they tend to have ocular injuries also, and they don't understand the gravity of it, how serious it can be for them. But these are the things that are seen. Some children are so violent that they have a habit of punching themselves violently. Like they continuously punch themselves. Some kids have a habit of banging their head on the walls or on the floor
We
till
have
the
a
time
lot of children who
somebody
do
comes
that.
and stops them.
Yes.
So that
And
ability is there just to grab the attention of the parents. So moment the parent is there, they stop doing that because the motive is served, the purpose is served. But they tried everything in their power just to get that attention. So that is
okay.
one thing the parents have to look out for.
And what is the percentage of this your pervasive developmental disorders in premature children?
So PDD, as per our study, was somewhere around 40%, 38 to 40% of children we have come across as per the prevalence, as per the study which was done in our setup.
Okay. No, it's a very important thing, see, because what happens is that many a times when these children come, they give a pamphlet saying that, you know, that there is a report saying that child has optic atrophy, and they have been told that nothing can be done for these children. But the thing is, and then they have advised a VEP for these children, and that's the end of the story. Because if the VEP shows a subnormal kind of effect, or it shows a flat line, then they say no, this child is not capable of getting any kind of vision back. That is one myth which has to be bust, because generally for my patients, when they come and if they have been informed a VP has to be done, I tell them, yes, you can do it, but it is not mandatory for it, whatever treatment we are going to be giving you. Because what happens is that this of optic atrophy in these children, even if it's a temporal pallor or whatever, is not synonymous with the kind of visual improvement that you can give a child. It's not synonymous with the kind of visual acuity that the child can finally regain. So the thing is that these children, just on the basis of optic atrophy or pallor of the optic nerve, cannot be decried of, or on a VP cannot be decried of as a child who will not have any kind of improvement with rehabilitation. So that is a myth which has to be bust. And there was a child who came like that. The child had a minor degree of temporal pallor. The child was in Amsterdam. Indian child, but was in Amsterdam, and there they were told that no, your child is blind, and there's nothing which will help. And when the child came here, we rehabilitated the child, gave the child glasses. Now the child is happily running around the house, and he's just doing everything possible. So the parents are very grateful for that. So this is one take-home point which we have to stress in all these children who have these kind of problems. What do you have to say, Anand? Any other last comments? Anisha, Himika, any last comments before they're showing us time's up?
Only I think correct glasses, giving correct eye prescriptions, and asking the parents to make them wear those glasses, and following amblyopia therapy diligently.
Very true. So, can we close the session now?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
I know there were 11 participants, of which most of them were.
These are just the panelists. The delegates view it on another platform.
Correct. I know. But then on a Sunday evening, I really wonder
I know that.
how
No,
they
but-
must be sitting there to watch visual rehabilitation. I only saw Neeraj over there in the panel which was there. So I said, okay, I'm happy at least one person is there. Anyway, thank you very much. This was a very informative, nice. It was a good discussion that we've had also, and thank you, Anand, Anisha, and Himika, for being there on this course, and thank you, the technical people, for a very seamless kind of what do you say? I'm not getting the word. I'm forgetting it. So, bye, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I thank all the speaker for the wonderful presentation, and I thank ma'am for leading the sessions amazingly. Thank you so much.